I heard this story not long ago, and I remember this is what my aunt, who worked in a nursing home, told me. She told me about a hospital or something like that, like a nursing home. And here, it was normal for the elderly to pass away, nothing unusual. At the time of the incident, she had only recently joined the nursing home. One day when she was on a shift, she saw a lot of people gathered from afar. She thought there might have been a dispute, so she came to inspect. It turned out that there was no dispute at all. It was just Miss Lou, an elderly person, who said that she was going to go somewhere really far away, so she insisted that she wanted to give the people all of her things. Her statement made my aunt very curious and wondered where she was going to move to or what had happened to her. Miss Lou didn't say clearly where she was going, but she told my aunt a strange thing, that she didn't have much time left to live because she had seen Miss Shen. Miss Lou's words made it very difficult for my aunt to understand, and it seemed that my aunt didn't even know who Miss Lou just mentioned, so she really wanted to know who this Miss Shen was. But when my aunt wanted to ask for more details, she was dragged away by a former employee. Later, the former employee told her about a rumor related to Miss Shen that anyone who saw her would die. When it was dark, a lot of strange things happened in this nursing home. In the corridors, there was often the sound of someone's footsteps walking very gracefully. In addition, it was the sound of some high heels stepping on the ground so loudly that it almost filled the entire space at the time. In particular, this was a woman wearing a red cheongsam, a traditional Chinese dress, which appeared, and they thought this might be the Miss Shen everyone was talking about. Then Miss Shen went to a room. After entering that room, Miss Shen went to sit next to an old woman and talk to her. The next morning, that old lady would die in that room, so the elderly in the nursing home all believed in the existence of Miss Shen. But when my aunt heard the story, she was confused and didn't know whether to believe if this rumor was true or not. As for the former employee, when she told the story, she also seemed to believe some of these things to be completely true. She told my aunt to be especially careful at night. On the next day, Miss Lou was sick and was taken to the hospital for emergency treatment, but she could not be cured and passed away that night. At first, my aunt thought it was just a coincidence, until one day she had to work the night shift. Their management style was very screw-like, and at night they usually would turn off the lights, and no one was allowed to move around except if they wanted to go to the bathroom. It was around 11:40 p.m. when my aunt was in her office. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a sudden sound of footsteps outside the door, and it came from high heels. The problem was, the elderly people in the nursing home didn't wear high heels, and the staff they were not allowed to wear them, but there was a sound coming from those high heels. Out of curiosity, she got up and went to see who it was. When she was about to reach out to open the door, she suddenly got a little scared, and she remembered the story of Miss Shen at that moment. Although she didn't believe it to be true, my aunt was still a bit scared to be alone at night like that. After she was mentally prepared, she carefully opened the door gently, but she couldn't believe she just opened the door and then heard the sound of heels hitting the ground, and it was getting closer and clearer. At the time, she slowly poked her head out the door and looked in the direction of the noise. It was unbelievable when my aunt saw there was no sign of anyone at all, and the footsteps would become less and less audible. But the interesting thing was that the sound of the heels would turn in another direction. Because she was more curious than usual, she followed the sound of the shoes to see who it was. And when the sound of the high heels became more and more shrill, as if every step that woman took was weighing more and more on my aunt's heart, she got closer and her fear grew bigger and bigger. She became extremely worried. After walking for a while, she turned to another corner, but there was no road ahead. At that time, my aunt thought she would definitely meet this Miss Shen, but no, it was completely different from what she expected. She only vaguely saw a red patch drifting into a room in the middle of the night, and it was completely different from the explanation that the former employee had told her. Immediately she ran and chased into that room, but when she arrived there was nothing to see. She looked through the little window above the door. This machine still hadn't appeared, and the people there were sleeping peacefully. At that time, my aunt really didn't know if she had heard it wrongly or looked at it wrong. She also found the story really ridiculous and became more and more worried about whether the rumor was true or not. The next day, a colleague told my aunt about the trouble going on in the nursing home. There was an old man here who said that Machine came to see him and he thought he was going to die, so he refused to get up and eat with everyone. After finishing a few errands in the nursing home, my aunt came to see the old man and talk to him about what had happened. When she found out that the old man's room was the room where the strange footsteps stopped, she was quite amazed. The old man passed away. This made her start to believe that the rumors might be true and that Machine could actually exist. For this reason, my aunt went to ask a lot of elderly people in the nursing home what they knew about this Machine. It was quite interesting that these people could describe Machine, not only the color of her dress but also her height. They could tell exactly what she looked like, but each person had a very different description of Machine's face. Because my aunt had a background in art, she drew Machine very well and beautifully with a tall and thin figure, her hair in a high bun. She was wearing a red Cheongsam outfit and high heels, but my aunt couldn't draw her face because no one knew what Machine's real face looked like. When it came to the profession of carrying coffins, there were many taboos as well as scary stories happening around it. For example, a person doing this job was absolutely not allowed to have sex the night before, not to get married or have children, to avoid injury, and not to let blood get on the coffin. And most important taboo was that from the moment the coffin was lifted until the grave was reached, the coffin must not touch the ground. And the person carrying the coffin must not complain or say negative words, no matter how tired they were. Speaking of which, I want to tell you about a true story that happened in my village. That year, a 70-year-old woman died of illness in my village. Her family also held a funeral for her. At the time, the management of funerals was very strict due to concerns about epidemics. The older woman family hired workers from a nearby mine for the burial, and these people knew absolutely nothing about the burial customs in our village. Taking advantage of the early morning hours, they proceeded to carry the coffin, not knowing that something terrible was waiting for them ahead. They did not have much experience in burial, but it must be said that they were in good health. Carrying the coffin was not a problem for them, because to ensure safety, not to violate the government's ban, the funeral took place without drums, and everyone went quietly to the back of the mountain. In the past, our villagers used to bury their relatives in a cemetery in the forest. It was about 2 kilometers from the village. The path was not difficult at all. However, while carrying the coffin near the cemetery, the coffin carriers suddenly felt that something was wrong. The coffin suddenly became very heavy, and the road became steeper, making the steps quite heavy too. Everyone felt that the road that day seemed a bit strange. "Oh my God! Why is it so heavy?" said one of the group members carrying the coffin. His elbows were shaking from the coffin's weight. Before they could continue, everyone felt that the coffin was a bit heavier than usual. The weight made the group stop because they couldn't stand it anymore. At this point, one of the group thought that maybe due to going uphill the coffin would be heavier. The man did his best to exhort the people in the group to keep going. It was also close to the cemetery at that time. Everyone in the group tried to carry the coffin with all their might, even though it was growing strangely heavier. And at that very moment, something monstrous happened. The coffin suddenly shook violently. Then there were loud noises on the coffin lid. It seemed that someone inside was trying to break through to get out. The old woman had been dead for a few days. Was it possible that the old woman had come back to life? Family members of the old woman were also surprised. The coffin shook more and more violently each day, accompanied by high-pitched explosions coming from the coffin. The coffin carriers were trying their best at this point, but the weight of the coffin held them tightly. Suddenly an explosion rang out in the sky, accompanied by the boos of many people around. The coffin fell to the ground because of the steep slope. The people carrying the coffin fell backwards. Both the body and the coffin slid down the slope. The coffin slid down the slope for a while and then stopped. Everyone rushed over to hold the coffin upright. At that time, the family members of the old woman also expressed panic. They looked at each other without knowing what to do next. Scary things kept happening. Inside the coffin, the sound of smashing continued to be deafening. The noise grew louder in this quiet forest. The noises were getting louder by the moment as the old woman inside was seemingly about to rush out. The onlookers felt extremely frightened. Everyone panicked. It was the first time people had encountered such a situation. Someone was going to take a rope to open the coffin and take a look inside. Just then, an old man approached and said that they had broken some taboos against the dead. "Come on, one of you got hurt, right?" The old man was an experienced person in this matter because he had seen such a situation in his youth, so he asked. Sure enough, someone was injured during the mining process among the workers carrying the coffin. So the old man quickly lit incense and prayed for the soul of the old woman to forgive their mistakes. The old man said that the wounds on the workers' hands had accidentally caused blood to stick to the coffin walls. This thing was a taboo. Everyone must kneel and ask for forgiveness. The old woman's family and the workers carrying the coffin nervously watched the old man's actions. Incense was lit, and the old man also performed the ritual to apologize to the deceased. Just burning paper, the old man prayed for the old woman to pass away peacefully. Everyone knelt around to bow to the coffin. At this point, the wind was strong, and the inside of the coffin kept making shrill noises. However, the coffin had not stopped. The old man suspected that there was still guilt on the part of the family. He asked the old woman's relatives to sincerely admit their mistakes, and after a while the coffin stopped shaking. Everyone gradually returned to its original calm state. Suddenly, the old woman's son explained that it was indeed the fault of him and his wife, because last night they slept together. The old man explained that thing was a taboo to do, to have sex in the family that night. Luckily, the apology was accepted by the dead. People continued to carry the coffin up towards the burial. From that moment on, nothing happened. The coffin was taken to the cemetery and properly buried. Later, I learned more taboos about coffin carrying. There were scary things that could cost people their lives. Later, when I have a chance, I will tell you all about it. My name is Yao. After leaving my hometown for the city, I got a job in a good company. Because I was a quiet person, most of the time in the company I didn't even interact with my colleagues. There's only one person that I talk to the most. Maybe it was because we were the same age. It seemed to be easy to communicate with one another. We had many topics in common. His name was Jakey, and he was working in the same department as I was. One day, Jakey went to work with a tired and sluggish look. Normally, he was very cheerful and a sociable person. He always smiled and said hello when he met his colleagues, but today he passed me without even looking. I was surprised, so I called him over. I discovered that his face was not just tired, but also looked kind of emaciated, like someone who was severely undernourished, so I asked him more about it. After hearing his story, I couldn't help but be shocked and didn't know what to say to Jakey, but he said that recently he was looking for a new room to rent. According to him, he saw a poster about a room for rent on a board in that neighborhood. Because the rent was quite cheap, as soon as he looked at the poster, he was attracted to it. So he immediately contacted the owner of the inn and scheduled a visit to see the room. The room was in a house. The road to get there was also quite easy and also close to the company. Jakey could walk to work, so he can save quite a bit of money too. Would all be shared with other people in other rooms in the house. The room is also relatively old, not new at all. So he was thinking, but because the price was cheap and the owner kept standing next to him, he was convinced and agreed to move in. After that, the owner also intended to ask Jakey to give him the money firsthand. Without thinking much, he just thought it was fine to give the money to the owner. He was worried that maybe he would spend that money on something else. Nothing was strange at this point. It was just that Jakey felt his room was a bit cold, but he didn't notice anything strange. On the same floor as Jakey, there was another man. He had a rough appearance that looked like a market gangster. He seemed to have just moved in there about a week before him. He often sat in the living room and watched television. His voice was very loud. According to the phone calls that Jakey overheard, it seemed that he did not have a decent job. Frequently, there were calls that made him uncomfortable, and then he scolded badly, as if his job was to collect loans. That was the type of tone he had. But because he didn't socialize, Jakey didn't want to be curious about other people's lives. He just overheard it briefly and didn't pay any attention. Jakey just passed him and went to the window to dry clothes. Strange things only started happening when Jakey was there for almost a month. That night Jakey worked late, so when he arrived the house was dark. Because it was late, Jakey quickly got ready and went to take a shower, but as he passed the living room, he heard a sound. Curious, Jakey stopped by to check it out, because by the time he got home, he didn't see anyone. Everyone had already gone to their rooms and turned off the lights to go to sleep a long time ago. At this moment, the living room TV was being turned on and hosting a food program or something. On the sofa, there was a figure of someone watching intently. Jakey tried to look closely to see who it was, but it was completely impossible to see the face. Then suddenly, it blurred in a vague way, even though the light from the television was still shining brightly. By default, it was the scary gangster guy on the same floor. Jakey didn't think much, so he continued to go to the bathroom. After taking a shower, Jakey was about to return to his room when he saw that the TV was still playing the food program from earlier, but it was empty. Jakey was angry because he thought the scary gangster guy didn't turn off the TV after finishing watching. Jakey accidentally stepped on something sticky on the ground near the sofa. It was dark yellow and very sticky. Curiously, Jakey touched it, and as soon as he brought it up to see what it was, a rancid smell hit his nose. It was like the smell of decaying food. It made Jakey extremely nauseous, but he still tried to get a mop to clean the floor. After all, it was still a common area, and he couldn't just leave it like that. There was another strange thing that made him think. That room of the scary gangster guy was very quiet. The lights had been turned off since Jakey came back. Even when he saw a figure sitting on the sofa in his room, there was no light either. Was it true that he watched TV? Nah, Jakey didn't feel too suspicious, so he quickly returned to his room. Anyway, he still had to go to work early the next morning. Not long after, the company held a birthday party for Jakey. He drank until he got drunk and then dragged himself home. At this time, his mind was no longer clear. He was so drunk that he couldn't even go to his room, so he fell on the couch to sleep without caring about anything around him. Now the drunkenness had completely overpowered him. In the dream, he felt his whole body going cold. Even the air around him suddenly turned very cold. Now he thought he was drunk, but he could still feel the cold air. At the time he was half awake, Jakey saw the TV suddenly turned on and was showing some food programs again. He didn't know who turned it on. Maybe it was the scary gangster guy again. From the darkness of the house, a tall, black, scary figure approached him. Although the figure was large, his steps were very light. None of the movements could be heard, as if he was gliding towards him off the ground. Suddenly the big man figure approached and he used his tongue to lick Jakey's face. Although he hadn't woken up from his drunkenness yet, he could completely feel the stickiness on his face. So immediately, he got up from his drunken state and also found that he was indeed being harassed by someone. He panicked and shouted loudly. Then he also stood up from the sofa and flailed his arms and legs to chase this pervert away. But the strange thing was that the moment the figure seemed to be vaporized into thin air. Only Jakey was left in the dark room and the glimmer of light coming from the television. At this moment he was extremely shocked. He didn't know if he was dreaming or awake. At first Jakey still thought that he was too drunk, so he was a bit paranoid. But after touching his own face, he suddenly felt a burning pain, like he was burned with boiling water, and that pain was right where he felt the lick from someone. Jakey started to panic. He rushed to the bathroom to look in the mirror, and indeed, in the painful spot, his skin was also tanned and dry. His face looked suddenly sunken. After that, Jakey was also unable to explain what happened to him, just because he was drunk. So he was paranoid at that time, but he himself knew that everything was not that simple to explain. An invisible fear prevented Jakey from standing for too long in the living room or sitting on the sofa again. Every day when going to work and after work, Jakey always passed by the living room. Every time he couldn't help but look curiously at the sofa. It made him shiver and then recall the incident that night. One day he got off work as usual. Then it was already dark and Jakey went to the bathroom to change. Even though he didn't want to, he needed to go there. He had to go across the sofa. Finishing everything, Jakey went to his room to go to bed early, but he remembered that he had to return to the company, so he had to carry his bag to go out. After returning, Jakey saw the scary gangster guy. He just sat there and watched TV on the sofa. Fearing that the scary gangster guy would face something scary like Jakey did, Jakey spoke up and tried to warn him about it. He said that that chair had a problem and advised him to go to his room sooner. But of course, his words were completely useless to a gangster. He saw Jakey as a coward and a paranoid person while mocking Jakey. Jakey was so angry that he didn't want to interfere anymore. He angrily left and went to his room and thought he would never care about the gangster guy again. So, to relieve his frustration, Jakey took out his phone and played a few games to clear his mind and stop thinking about other things. After a while, Jakey also prepared to take a bath. The living room was so quiet then. No more laughing from this gangster guy. Jakey also felt strange. Stepping out of his room, Jakey saw the gangster guy still sitting on the chair, but strangely enough he didn't move at all. He was just sitting like a statue. His body was shaking in waves. Sweat was pouring out like rain, drenching his face. He wanted to call out for help, but he couldn't open his mouth or move anymore. Entering the bathroom door, Jakey panicked when he looked in the mirror and saw a shadow of a person standing outside by the sofa. There was not only the gangster guy there, but something else. He clearly saw a tall man standing behind the gangster guy, his hands holding the guy's shoulders, making his whole body motionless. Jakey knew that the man behind the gangster guy was definitely not a human. Next, he suddenly bent down and licked the gangster guy's head, so that was exactly the same thing that happened to Jakey that night. He was licked. It was true that he wasn't paranoid. The big fat guy pressed his shoulder tightly with his hand. His whole body was drenched with sweat. His eyes widened like a person who was near death. Just like Jakey, the top of the head where the fat guy licked him was immediately red and swollen with a long streak. It didn't stop there. He continued to look again, his face gray and sore, and he also secreted something greasy in the hideous areas. Strangely, this time the licked place was no longer simply red and swollen. It started to develop large and small blisters all over the wound. That looked extremely nauseating and horrible. It seemed that the gangster guy could still feel everything, but couldn't move or resist. He could only glance around. Seeing such a terrifying scene, Jakey was also extremely panicked. He wanted to scream but was so afraid that angry fat man would harm the living people. He was confused too as to how to help the gangster guy. He looked around to see if there was anything that could be used in a situation like this. Finally, he discovered that the aluminium basin in his hand would work. Gritting his teeth to gather courage, Jakey decided to risk his life even though he was very scared. He rushed over and knocked hard on the bowl. It caused shrill noises and made the gangster guy's whole body jump. And it seemed that this method worked. The hideous ghost no longer controlled the guy, but had turned his attention to Jakey. The ghost looked at Jakey with an angry expression because he dared to ruin his business. Its whole face was clearly visible. Its eyes were white and its face became soggy and sticky with mucus. For a moment, Jakey suddenly had a bold idea. He thought to wake the gangster guy out of his ambiguity, so he ignored the ghost standing next to him and rushed to use the laundry basin to hit the gangster guy in the head. The blow that hit the man made him swoop forward and hit his face on the table. Right after that, Jakey also realized that the ghost was still standing behind him. Worried that he would control him as he did with the gangster guy, Jakey ran as fast as he could into his room to hide there. He also hoped that this way he could make the fat ghost disappear. A few minutes later, Jakey dared to show his face out of the door to observe what was going on. A man who knew only studying like him really had to put all his courage to do scary things like that. But fortunately, the gangster guy recovered his sanity. He sat on the ground and rubbed his head with his hand. Seeing Jakey in the distance, his eyes filled with tears and his face was contorted. He ran over and hugged Jakey like a baby and cried. He also recounted that he was watching TV when he felt someone's hands holding his shoulders, which made his whole body stiff with fear. Even when he was licked on top of his head, he could clearly feel the burning pain. As soon as the both of them calmed down, they decided to go to the house owner to find out what was going on. With a rough face and the scary aura of the gangster guy, the owner quickly told all the truth. He said it was true that a person had just died in that living room. But because he was afraid of the impact on the rent, he tried to hide it away. It was a tall and very fat man. He was always eating something. He worked in the stock market, so as soon as he saw the clean room he was satisfied and moved in right away. He ate a lot, and he did not exercise. With no relatives coming to visit him, he started to fall ill. One day, while watching TV in the living room, he passed away from a heart attack. After listening, the gangster guy was extremely angry and asked the owner to return the rent to him. And about Jakey, he wanted the owner to rent it out for free to Jakey if he continued to stay there. Only a few months later, the wound on the gangster's head quickly became cold, but it still left a big scar. He didn't mind that. Maybe it made his job easier to be scary. It is really cool to have such a big scar on the top of your head when you need to collect debts. This thrilling story happened before I was even born. I later heard from my grandmother that my grandfather was still very young at that time. The whole family lived in a small village. My grandfather was probably about 13 years old then. My grandfather's name was Shan, and he had an honest disposition. One day, Mr. Shan was asked by his father, my great-grandfather, to deliver cakes to an acquaintance. On the way back, Mr. Shan suddenly saw something glimmering on the side of the road. That was also the first time my grandfather saw the strange thing. My grandfather crept along the grass to take a closer look inside. It turned out that the thing that flashed was a big snake with its whole body in a pure white color. Its eyes were bloodshot, but for some reason, it just lay there unresponsive. Looking closer, the snake still had a lot of blood. It looked tired and exhausted. Although seeing a snake with such a strange color for the first time, he was a bit scared. Mr. Shan still used a dry wooden branch and tried to touch it. It just lay there and had no intention of attacking my grandfather. So with his honesty, he decided to help the snake. Mr. Shan carefully lifted the snake with a branch, then slowly put it into a basket. He didn't even forget to put a cloth over it, afraid that other people would be afraid to stop him. Mr. Shan was careful, moving little by little, carrying the heavy basket home. He thought long and hard and decided to go to the kitchen. Looking around, Mr. Shan saw a large jar in the corner of the kitchen. It was his home's water storage jar for when it rained. This jar was the only one big enough to hold the snake. For some reason, he felt a connection with the animal. It was also very gentle, not intending to attack him. After putting it in the jar of water, he did not forget to tell it to be obedient there before closing the lid. And so, in the days that followed, he took great care of the white snake. In the countryside, each family had a few hens that lay eggs. Every day he would sneak out and get some eggs for the snake. He was caught by his mother many times, but he still tried to hide the fact that he kept a snake in the house. Every day my great-grandmother wondered why the eggs in the barn kept disappearing, strangely enough. She thought it might be because the hens refused to lay eggs. But Mr. Shan did not even notice his mother. He still tried to take care of this beloved animal. Every day a few eggs would be taken so that the snake would gradually heal its wound. One day, like every other day, my grandfather ran as fast as he could into the kitchen, hiding some eggs in his shirt. However, when he opened the lid of the water jar, he was extremely alarmed because the beloved snake he had worked so hard to take care of for nearly 2 months had disappeared. In the jar, now only the eggshells were left. Mr. Shan burst into tears, not wanting to make his parents know what was happening. A few years later, he accidentally saw that the old white snake had returned, and it seemed to be much bigger, but the snake never appeared completely. It only peeked behind objects in the house. Even my great-grandmother saw it appear on the ceiling several times. She was a little worried, not knowing what purpose a snake had coming back here. So during a meal, my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather had a discussion about the snake. She said that it appeared more and more in the house and it was getting bigger and bigger. She was afraid that something bad would happen. My great-grandfather didn't think so. He decided to bring some cake after dinner and went to find a famous shaman in the village to ask him about this matter. After arriving at the place, my great-grandfather narrated the incident to the shaman. The shaman also pondered for a long time, pressing something incomprehensible in his hand. In the end, he said this thing was a great blessing and not a bad thing or a bad omen at all. After listening to him, my great-grandfather was delighted and asked the shaman for more details. The shaman said snakes were sentient beings, and this snake was not an ordinary snake. The snake decided to follow my grandfather and bless him, so the shaman asked my great-grandfather to come home and build a small altar for the snake. After that, my great-grandfather did a good job. The crop was abundant and the snake rarely appeared in the house. A long time after that, my grandfather's family also made an unexpected fortune, building the most spacious house in the village. The whole family wondered if it was related to the snake or not. At the time, my grandfather was also an adult and married. His work and study path were also extremely favorable. That year, unfortunately, bandits from the mountain would often come down to the village to disturb the peace and plunder. They did not stop there. They would even kill innocent villagers. Because they were in a remote area, bandits hardly respected anyone. And of course, the place they were aiming for was my grandfather's house, since the house looked the biggest in the village. There were bound to be plenty of things for them to rob, they thought. After a few minutes of probing, bandits decided to ride their horses and stormed inside. Big strong horses broke through the gate. They used guns to shoot many times into the night sky, making everyone afraid. They then arrested Mr. Shan's family and threatened them with guns. Although Mr. Shan was angry, there was nothing he could do. Mr. Shan got angry and told the bandits they could take everything in the house but leave his family alone. After hearing this, the bandits showed a proud smile. But of course, they were a bunch of bottomless feeders with greed. The bandits not only wanted to rob, but also saw that my grandmother was beautiful at that time, so they desired her. Seeing the bandits touching his wife, my grandfather tried to resist and shoved his hand away, but only received a blow from hell. Then one of them overpowered him with a gun, and two more forced my grandmother and another female into a room. Seeing his wife being bullied without being able to do anything, my grandfather became angry. He howled and cursed at them for being assholes. But they seemed to feel proud about it. One of the bandits would hit him on the head with the handle of a gun, causing him immense pain. They felt that he had a lot of annoying words to say, so they surrounded him and kicked him repeatedly with their feet. Because of an honest farmer like Mr. Shan, he could only hold his head in battle. Suddenly, from inside the room, a high-pitched scream made the bandits outside also stop in their tracks. Then, the bandit who forced my grandmother into the room was pushed out by something so strongly that he flew through the air as well as the window. The other bad guys gathered around him and saw that his whole body seemed to be crumbling and becoming horribly deformed. This scene made the rest of them start to panic because, of course, women couldn't do this to a man. They gathered and raised their guns in defense and then slowly entered the room. They carefully opened the door and gently stepped inside because they knew that the normal person couldn't break another one's limbs so easily. The villagers around now dared to approach and help my grandfather up. His face was covered in blood and he didn't know what was happening inside his house. Another scream rang out, and my grandmother and the maid rushed out and were not heard at all. My grandfather, Mr. Shun, insisted that his wife would be beside him. My grandmother was still scared, but she also told him that a large white snake had appeared and killed all the bandits. That's right, the old white snake had returned. Now it was a large monster. It must have been more than 10 meters long. It used its tail to wrap tightly around the necks of the bandits, breaking their bones. When the villagers and my grandfather heard everything was quiet, they dared to come in and see the bandits' bodies lying across the floor. Everyone teamed up to dig a hole next to the forest and bury the bandits. Then, I heard my grandmother tell me that when my grandfather was old and sick and near death, he saw a young man appear in front of him. The young man was tall and had white hair and a pale skin. The young man said that he was the white snake. He explained that he was the one who was saved by my grandfather and in return wanted to protect my grandfather's family for the rest of his life. So, its altar was preserved by my grandparents and passed on to descendants. To this day, I still light incense to give thanks. I was only 10 years old that year, and my parents worked far away, so I had to stay at my grandmother's house for a while. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, so she lived alone. When she heard that I was coming to stay, my grandmother was very happy. She loved me very much and took good care of me, but I was a very rude child. I frankly disparaged the food she cooked because it was not delicious. I was also very harsh on a few other things that made her very sad. Looking back on that period in my life, that was in the countryside and was quite interesting. After dinner, I and a few neighborhood kids played around. My grandmother and her friends would sit and chat while watching us. That evening, my grandmother needed to take some things to my aunt. She told me to come home earlier and look after her house. But she was gone for a long time, about 2 to 3 hours, and it was getting dark outside. The children who played with me all had to go back home to go to bed already, leaving only myself and a few older people sitting around. There was no one to play with, so I went back home. Since I was home alone, I decided to close every door. When I finished, I waited all by myself. After waiting for my grandmother for a while, I started getting tired and fell asleep. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening and she still hadn't come home yet. As I fell asleep, I started to hear noises inside of the house. I heard someone walking around, but the footsteps were very light. At first I thought my grandmother might have been back, and that's when I woke up. And I thought again that something might have been wrong because her footsteps was not light at all. I wondered if it was a thief, and I was thinking about what to do next when I heard a man call someone else's name. This person's voice sounded very sad, and the last syllable was still lingering from afar and near, making me shiver. The man came out of the kitchen and his legs were hovering in the air. He suddenly lifted the curtain as I was scared to death. The figure of the older man with eyes bulging, his dry smile and hideous whisper still haunts me to this day. I was so scared that I buried my head in the blanket to hide, and I cried without a sound, scared, clenching my fists and whispering to my grandmother to come back soon. Even so, I could still sense that the ghost was doing something. He seemed to be wandering around the house, calling out someone's name and searching for things. Then, seemingly finding nothing, he slowly returned to the kitchen. I don't know where I got the courage from, but as soon as I heard silence, I decided to open the window and get out of there. As I walked out the door, I dared to cry, and as I ran, I cried and cried for my life. Unfortunately, my grandmother had not yet returned. She was probably still spending time with people nearby. Seeing me crying like that, the ladies in the street immediately asked me what happened. I panicked and told everyone what happened. The information I gave them confused all of them. One of the men in the neighborhood picked up some sticks and went to my grandmother's house. He searched everywhere with his friends, looking inside and outside, but not seeing anything strange like I did. A neighbor asked me again if the door was closed or not, and how could outsiders get in if it was? And even if they did, they couldn't get out so quickly. They asked me if I'm sure I wasn't dreaming. I knew I wasn't dreaming, and I assured them that the ghost was looking for someone named Bella. The neighbors told me that Bella was the name of my grandmother. This I did not know. The lady next door kept asking me what the eccentric man was looking for in my grandmother's house. She and a few others found it a bit strange. Seeing me alone was also not good, so a few people stayed with me to wait for my grandmother to return. After a while, my uncle appeared. He took me to the hospital to see my grandmother because while she was away, she had a heart attack and had to be hospitalized for urgent treatment. On the way, I was very nervous. At the hospital, I quickly ran to the room where she was lying. My grandmother's health had stabilized. I told her what happened at their house, and everyone was stunned, not knowing if it was an omen, because at the time the strange man appeared to me. That was exactly the same time my grandmother was receiving emergency heart treatment. This story is about something that happened 10 years ago in my village. One day we heard the sound of an ambulance and saw a crowd gather around some accident that occurred. The person lying on the stretcher was Mr. Kim. No one knew why he fainted. In the early morning, people heard a very loud scream coming from his house. The villagers expressed suspicion, and yesterday they also saw him bring back a very large ceramic jar from somewhere. They suspected that what happened to Mr. Kim had something to do with that jar. After the ambulance had left, the villagers still gathered and gossiped about it. Some even said that Mr. Kim must have encountered some sort of ghost. Yesterday morning, Mr. Kim alone carried a hoe to the cornfield area to hoe and sow new seeds. This area was along the riverside in the village. The land was barren, only suitable for growing corn, and Mr. Kim was plowing the land with great enthusiasm. Suddenly the handle of the hoe seemed to hit something. Mr. Kim stopped. He discovered something underneath. To prevent the hoe from breaking the object below, Mr. Kim used his hand to dig up the soil. Suddenly he was surprised. Below was a black ceramic jar. People like Mr. Kim knew very well that this was an antique jar because the local government had reported that his village area had many antiques, and people who could dig antiques were going to be paid a huge amount of money. It took a while for Mr. Kim to dig up the jar. He poured out all the soil inside, but at the moment he didn't notice that there was some strange debris inside. He was quite nervous. Mr. Kim quickly slung the jar over his shoulder, hoping that no one would see it. Then he took it home, full of joy because this time he believed he was gonna get rich. When he got home, to prevent some snoopers from stealing the jar, Mr. Kim left it in the living room. That night, Mr. Kim lay awake thinking about what he would use the money for after he made his fortune, because he was so happy. He lay tossing and turning. His wife also urged him to go to sleep. At midnight, suddenly Mr. Kim smelled something rotten. He placed his hand on his nose because the smell was extremely bad. "Damn it! What's that smell? What stinks so? Did you fart?" Suspecting that his wife farted, Mr. Kim loudly asked her that. However, at this time his wife was also sleeping deeply. Just then, suddenly Mr. Kim heard someone's gasp coming from somewhere. Even stranger than that was when Mr. Kim heard the breathing sound coming from the living room. He started feeling worried. Could a thief be breaking into his house? Or are they intending to steal the jar? Thinking about that, Mr. Kim got out of bed. He reached for a flashlight to go out of the living room to check it out. As soon as the door of the living room was open, there was a hazy fog around. The inside of the living room was empty. There were no strangers at all. Mr. Kim looked around, not knowing where the breathing sound was coming from. The stench still wafted around the room. He covered his nose with his hand. The smell was like the smell of a dead rat. He didn't know where it came from. At the moment, suddenly there was a groan from the jar, which caught the attention of Mr. Kim. What was even stranger than that was that something black was protruding from the top of the jar. Mr. Kim was very surprised. The rotten smell was coming from this jar, but it was clear that when he bought the jar, he had already poured out all the sand and soil inside. At this moment, he felt curious, so he approached the jar to check. Mr. Kim pointed the flashlight towards the jar. What was that black thing that appeared to be protruding from it in the dark? Right after that, he suddenly became terrified and speechless when he witnessed what was going on. A human head was protruding from the jar. Groaning came from it. He was now numb with his legs, Mr. Kim. He raised his eyes to look inside the jar, inside the long hair that covered the face. The face looked up at Mr. Kim, blood oozing from its eyes. A very scary picture. Mr. Kim shouted. The head also slowly emerged from the jar, as Mr. Kim was so scared that his face became pale. He fell on his back. For the first time in his life, he witnessed such a terrifying scene. The head emitted a stench accompanied by lifeless eyes. The mouth gradually opened wide. When it screamed, there was no tongue inside. Only then did Kim realize that inside that jar was only a moving head. He knew that he had encountered some sort of ghost, and the crumbs he spilled in the morning were his ashes, which made him even more terrified and worried. Then he felt his surroundings darken. The stench was still around, until his wife found out and called an ambulance. Later, Mr. Kim was discharged from the hospital. He was severely psychologically affected, but only for a while. The government also came and took away the jar because it was an antique dating back to ancient times. In the old days in Korea, there used to be scary customs that punished criminals. Some of them were death by jars containing poison. The victim would slowly disintegrate and die painfully when immersed in a jar. Because the stench was still clinging to his house, Mr. Kim decided to invite a shaman to come and banish the evil from this house. Unfortunately, his dream of changing his life was officially extinguished by that very scary experience.